Yeah, it's a pretty unfair situation.
good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. How are we feeling? Good, good, good. Glad to see everyone. So good afternoon for Promise family and all of our viewers. Thank you so much for joining us for the Way Forward webcast series. We are talking about disrupting dehumanization. And this is hosted by Forward Promise. So we welcome you to this conversation. It's going to be a really, really powerful conversation. We're going to be streaming on Facebook and YouTube. And so in the light of our recent tragedies of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, and the permanent injury of Jacob Blake, we will be discussing solutions to affirm the humanity of boys and young men of color this afternoon. So we are a community in a village, and so we all have the opportunity to make a difference. So please, right now, I want you to invite 5 people to the webcast. So thank you for joining us. You made it. So invite 5 people to the conversation right now, and put it in the comment box who you invited and who you're watching with. So that would be a great way to get the community in the village involved in this conversation. So today we're really going to talk about disrupting cultural humanization through education and educational systems and policies. And we have a really great panel for you today. And I'm going to allow the panel to introduce themselves, but not before introducing myself. My name is Rabiatu, Barrie, an assistant professor of clinical psychology at ADLER University. I'm a Forward Promise fellow, so I've had the pleasure of working with some of these panelists very intimately. They're doing amazing work across the country, so I look forward to the powerful conversation that's going to be had today. So I'm just going to allow them each to introduce themselves because they could do a much better job than I could do in giving their work and themselves the justice they deserve. So we can start with you, Rhonda, if that's okay.
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Rhonda Bryant. I am president and CEO of the Mariah Group and co-director of the Forward Promise Initiative. I'm so excited for today's conversation. I know we're going to generate some really great dialogue and solutions.
Howard, would you like to go next?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Dr. Howard Stevenson, and I'm the co-director of Forward Promise and also director of the Racial Empowerment Collaborative at the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education. I am also delighted for today's conversation and can't wait to hear what our panelists have to say.
Hi, I'm Zakiya Sankara-Jabar. I am the National Director of Activism for brightbeam Network. brightbeam is a nonprofit network of education activists demanding a better education and a brighter future for every child. I'm also the co-founder of Racial Justice Now, which is based in Dayton, Ohio, and it is an advocacy, organizing, and policy grassroots education organization led by Black parents.
So I'll jump in. My name is Ron Walker. I'm the founding executive director of the Coalition of Schools Educating Boys of Color. We have as our mission statement the affirmative social, emotional, cultural, and academic development of boys and young men of color. I'm also a proud Forward Promise fellow, and I'm looking forward to the conversation, and thank you for inviting me.
Hi, everyone. My name is Claudia Jasso. Mi nombre es Claudia Jasso. I am the daughter of Ricardo and Estela Jasso. Soy la hija de Ricardo y Estela Jasso. I'm very happy to be here. I'm honored to be part of this discussion. And I work for Amistades. We are a nonprofit that empowers communities. We're very much focused on youth and in particular, helping them change the narrative, the negative narrative, by empowering them with tools that are associated with their culture and connecting to their heritage. Thank you.
I'll jump in. My name is William Jackson. I'm the founder and executive director of Village of Wisdom. We affectionately call it VAL. We work to protect Black genius. And what that means is that we look to advance the intellectual curiosity and protect the racial identity of Black children. We do that work by translating the wisdom of Black parents into culturally affirming and culturally responsive strategies for schools. And we try to support organizers and advocates by providing kind of evidence-based practices to support their demands for schools that do a better job of protecting Black genius.
Good morning, everybody. Here in Anpao, Duta, Makofi, Amachada, Wachiankapi. So my name is Anpao Duta, slang Earth. Everyone calls me Duta. Grew up on the Standing Rock Reservation. On my mom's side, I'm Lakota, Dakota, and Ojibwe. And on my dad's side, I'm Akino Atum from the Gila River Indian community. And I'm the executive director of the Native American Community Academy, charter school in Albuquerque, New Mexico, as well as the acting executive director for the NACA Inspired Schools Network, nationwide indigenous education network. And at our core, we're seeking to transform communities through indigenous education where students see themselves and communities and families play an active part in the creation of the vision and the mission of the school. So it's a center back on indigenous genius, identity genius, and the strength and the power that the community has always had. So thanks for having me this morning, this afternoon.
Wow, such an amazing, amazing panel. I'm so excited to hear what we have to talk about. During introductions, I hope you had time to invite your people to the conversation. So also tell us where you are. Where are you watching from? Who are you watching with? I'm gonna call a few people here, put it in the chat. So we have people calling from Rockland County, New York, Boston, Massachusetts, around there, Ron's neck of the woods. Where else are we watching from? Who are you watching with? All right. LA, nice, nice. Chicago, nice. Glad to see it. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So at this point, we're going to transition now to really set the groundwork and the framework for what we're going to be doing today and talking about. And we have Rhonda and Howard, who are going to give us a framework around dehumanization and the cultural and spiritual dehumanization that we'll be talking about, that we'll be focused on today for this webcast series. So Rhonda yes. And Howard, take it away.
Yes. Thank you, Rabiatu. I just want to start out by saying from the time we stepped on the planet, communities of color have looked up, prayed to, and relied on our creator, our ancestors, our spiritual medicine to heal, grow, and thrive in a world that didn't see them as human. Unfortunately, in the history of the United States, religion has been used as a hammer and a nail to lie, cheat, and subjugate people of color. Let us be clear. In our work at Forward Promise, we are suggesting that the primary tool or hammer of white supremacy has been dehumanization. At the center of dehumanization is the pervasive idea that people of color do not need and are not worthy of basic human dignities. Dehumanization threatens the healthy development of boys and young men of color and their villages and manifests in the narratives, policies, and practices that impact them. The psychological tool, the policy tool, the economic tool, and the theory tool has been dehumanization. We're here today to discuss how culture and spirit can disrupt dehumanization, but first we want to briefly review our model of dehumanization disruption. A basic definition of dehumanization for us is the persistent invalidation of humanity through perceptions or actual treatment. In many definitions, it also includes animalizing a group of people, their behaviors, and their actions. Dehumanization is the idea that people of color are unworthy and do not deserve basic human dignities. In many respects, we know that dehumanization threatens the health and is manifest in the narratives, policies, and in the way we see these practices across this country. If we can go to the slides. Now, the cycle of dehumanization in our model, in many respects, starts out with an understanding of the negative narratives toward boys and young men of color, towards people of color. And we think these narratives or stories that are created about communities of color lead to dangerous actions and justify unjustifiable actions towards communities and people of color. We think that there are incredible outcomes or impacts on communities that are harmful to our young people and to our communities in ways that we see not only in how Black and brown folks live, but also how they work and achieve. And eventually we see the impact of this on the way in which Black and brown folks are blamed for the actions that they engage in. The next slide, please. A lot of our work is based on the notion of racialized trauma and colonialism trauma, in which we have identified 5 different types of dehumanization. If we could go to the next slide: historical dehumanization, cultural and spiritual dehumanization, social dehumanization, emotional dehumanization, and physical dehumanization. First, historical dehumanization we would define as the thoughts, feelings, and actions that drive policies that in many respects lead to the destruction, the punishment, and the exploitation of land and people. In many respects, the ways in which we see what's going on in the world today explains just how we are in the conditions that we currently are. Culture and spiritual dehumanization, which Rhonda Bryant will talk more about, relates to thoughts, feelings, and actions that drive policies that demonize, disregard, devalue, or marginalize cultural and spiritual practices of communities of color. Social dehumanization is defined as the thoughts, feelings, or actions that drive policies that divert resources or fail to invest resources in communities of color. Social dehumanization is also about the restriction of the rights of these communities in the social and educational and legal arenas. Emotional dehumanization relates to the thoughts, feelings, or actions that drive policies that limit the expressions of empathy towards communities of color, demonize them when they express their emotions, and in many respects redefines Black and brown people's emotions as somehow pathological or problematic. And then finally, physical dehumanization is about thoughts, feelings, and actions that drive policies that place the physical bodies of members of communities of color at risk and as threats to the lives and experiences of others. In our work, we have defined the trauma of dehumanization as pervasive, but in many respects leads to, in our work, boys, young men of color and their families and their villages to think about not only themselves, but their communities and their people in negative ways. In some respects, our job in supporting grantees who are excellent at the process of providing culturally responsive programming to these communities, their job is to challenge those negative narratives and how they actually reside in the minds of our young people. If we could go to the last slide. In our view, we're not just interested in dehumanization as a concept. We're also interested in how these different types of dehumanization affect health outcomes. And in particular, there's been more research that identifies that dehumanization in these different forms affect blood pressure, affect the way that we think about our bodies, how we manage stress in the world, how we actually sleep, the quality of sleep, how we think about ourselves, and even mental health outcomes. So I want to, in some respects, looking forward to this conversation, we're going to talk specifically on cultural and spiritual dehumanization. I'm going to turn it over to Rhonda to give us some more clarity on that.
Sure. Thanks, Howard. So like you stated in the beginning, our culture and our spiritual practices, that's our medicine. And we have to protect it. We have to teach it to our children, and we have to give our children space to practice it because it's their connection to their ancestors. And it's also what grounds them and enables them to thrive. So we decided to frame our conversation today around schools and education because our schools are the first places where our children learn that their cultural traditions are not accepted in society. It's also the place where they spend tremendous amounts of time for basically the first 20 years of their lives. So, there's certainly other spaces in American society where our cultures are not valued. And we have countless examples about how our appearances are considered unkept or ghetto, until a white person wears the same clothes or the same hairstyle, and then it's considered exotic or retro. Our foods are loved, our music is loved and imitated. Our traditions, such as consensus building and ways of ensuring justice and fairness within our communities, they're stolen and renamed and then sold back to schools as a new professional development method, without ever acknowledging that the roots of some of these ways around consensus building actually come out of the history and the cultures of the very children that we're trying to work against in our school buildings. But we know that when we as people of color demonstrate our own culture through our own foods, music, hairstyles, through our own religious practices and ways of worship, through our own ways of relating to one another, the ways that we exercise leadership, and even our ways of building community to become spaces of access and power and liberation. When we do that for ourselves, we're marginalized at best. And in the worst instances, our efforts have literally been burned to the ground. So there's deep trauma within our communities from being told repeatedly that our heritage, that our practices, that our cultural traditions don't have a place in the society in which we live. And as much as parents and caregivers of children of color provide a counter narrative at home that lifts up our cultures as beautiful, our young people are still struggling with reconciling the differences between these two messages, what they're told in their homes and what they're told in their school buildings. And so it has to be a conversation about more than just people of color being the louder voices in the minds of their kids. There has to be a fundamental change in the way that schools understand and approach culture and cultural value, and how they translate that in terms of how they treat our children every day in schools. So, we've invited our friends of Forward Promise today to this conversation to talk about this issue because they're all deeply involved in transforming education in ways that address culture and cultural value. And so I know that our conversation today is going to point to the history and explaining it to people in a way that they understand, but also will contain many solutions that are going to help us to move forward and to transform education in meaningful ways. So I'm going to turn it back over to you, Rabi, so that you can begin this conversation today with all of our friends.
Wow, that was like a real quick and powerful. It was like boom, boom to the throat, right? Heard some really interesting things, and I think something that stood out so strongly was the idea that like dehumanization is like multi-leveled, multifaceted, right? It isn't just ideological, right? But it affects our actual physical well-being, like our lives and our mortality, right? And thinking about how schools are kind of like the first kind of like chronic exposure to the dehumanization of our spirit and our culture, right? And how much time we spend there. And that's like our children's first chronic encounter. And so really want, I know the panelists have been listening as well, to kind of like give your initial reactions to what we've just heard, keeping in mind that, we're going to talk about kind of like cultural dehumanization, the work that you do, but just thinking about what Rhonda and Howard just spoke about, kind of what are your initial reactions to what they've, shared with us this afternoon, really.
I'd like to just put things into a historical context for Latinos. Amistades is in Tucson and the southern Arizona border community. We are about 40 minutes away from the US-Mexico border. Tucson was Mexico. Arizona was Mexico before the US-Mexico war. And often youth that are Latino are made to feel like the other. And so we, as an organization, I'll talk later about solutions, but we have to acknowledge and name first that this is an issue here in our community. Specifically, I'm talking about Arizona and the border with Sonora, Mexico. We have to first be able to name it, and that's the first step, and then address it. But the U.S.-Mexico War ended in 1848, and I can tell you that around 1880, in terms of schools, there were escuelitas, or small schools that women started as a direct result of segregation in public schools, to teach youth about their heritage, their history, in their own language. So I think acknowledging that is really important for communities as they pave the way for healing and justice.
You know, I would add to what Reverend Bryant and Reverend Dr. Howard Stevenson laid out is the truth by saying amen, first of all. You know, and the dehumanization starts so early, as we know. You know, I'm thinking now as a former principal about the entry to preschool that Black boys have to begin. And if you think about the tale of two preschool boys, right? Both 3 years old or so, both anxious and ready to go to school, excited to have that first learning experience. One set of parents says to their son, go and have fun, enjoy the learning, all those kinds of encouragement that you expect all parents to give to their children. The other set of parents says, go to school, behave yourself, listen to the teacher, don't get in trouble, don't get in fights, sets that narrative up of what that young man is going to face. Obviously, I'm talking about Black boys. I'm talking about the Yale study that says, 3 times the rate of suspension, expulsion from schools than white counterparts. So, it starts there early. And when you think about that being labeled a troublemaker, when my white counterpart is labeled curious, or being labeled a problem when my white counterpart is labeled as being genius, then you know that it starts early. And it's incumbent upon, not only the education space, but the family space to understand how, and I want to talk about this a little bit more when I get the chance, how we inoculate our children, our boys in particular, given the work I do, so that they are vibranium, right? In the spirit of Black Panther, they already had the vibranium in them, but to make sure they understand what that vibranium is.
Yeah, this is Zakiya. I just want to piggyback on what Ron said, because that was certainly my experience, as a parent of a little 3-year-old Black boy. And I actually was the parent that encouraged him, was excited. This is, a new preschool. It's going to be great. The preschool is actually called Mini University. It's on the campus of the university that I was attending at the time. And unfortunately, if folks know my story, know that the history is that we did not have a good experience. My son certainly did not have a good experience in that school. In fact, he was labeled as a troublemaker. And if it was not for my own intuition as a parent, because I certainly wasn't politicized. I mean, I'm a Black woman in America. I know that race is an issue, but I wasn't as deeply knowledgeable about all the ways in which race really shows up until I had that experience of my baby, literally a 3-year-old, being identified by his white female teachers as a problem. That was something that was very new, but my intuition pushed back in the way in which they described him, the words that they used to describe a 3-year-old, I just knew intuitively were problematic. And so it literally sent me on a quest of gaining more knowledge about why this was happening, not just to him, but also to me, and the disruption that it actually caused for me in my own higher education learning experience. that's exactly how I began to organize other Black parents to, basically provide the knowledge that they needed, to make sure that we knew that we had choices and that we knew that we had options, not to just accept the narratives of the educator, but that we were our first child's teachers, and that we had every right and responsibility to push back. And I'll talk a little bit more later about everything that we did to do that. But certainly that was my experience as a mother of a 3-year-old Black boy.
Wow, that's powerful. That's really powerful. Thank you guys for that. We have Sharon Schultz, welcome you from Arizona, and Jamie from Tucson, Arizona, and Gina Bennett Womack from New Orleans. And so, we ask you to ask questions as we move forward, and we start asking, we're moving into the panelists now. They're going to tell us about cultural and spiritual dehumanization. And so invite more people to be part of the conversation, and don't be afraid. Please ask questions in the chat. And so, don't want to call people out, but Duta, there's a request, to hear your aspect on the historical kind of like response and, cultural dehumanization that Howard and Rhonda talked about. So if you could talk a little bit about it before we transition into the panel questions, that would be amazing. There's been a request for your wisdom. So if you could share, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And when Rhonda and Howard, when you both shared the context that we're talking about, I couldn't help but think about the inception of education for Indigenous populations in this country, in which we heard things like kill the Indian, save the man, right? Like that lined up clearly with the definition of dehumanization as you were presenting it. It also was really interesting for me to think about the effects, right? And so I think about the inception of boarding schools, the inception of formal schooling as we know it in the four walls of a school building, the cutting of the hair, the changing of the clothes, the lining up in neat rows and desks, and what that does to the spirit and to the emotion and to the mentality of a child. And then wherein then is there the affect for assimilation? And I think that is like generations later, as we see that there are, the creation of new boarding schools has stopped as of the late 1800s, but the effects that it has had on our generations, from language learning to cultural competency and knowledge, is still taking hold. And I think, the institution of education in this country is based upon an effort of assimilation and of violence, both physically, emotionally, spiritually. And it is a way of colonization. And it was one of the main tools for as I hear other perspectives. Claudia, you presented one around the Arizona, and that was once Mexico, and before that was the land of indigenous peoples. And what were the intentional efforts of colonization as a way of assimilation into a mindset that is the fundamental paradigm shift into something that represents an agenda that is disconnected from our communities? And I think that it has my mind and wheels and turning in so many different ways about how do you, what is the why and for what of what we have all been doing. Certainly at NACA and NISN, it is about recentering back on community genius, on our identity and who we are, because that has always held power.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much for that. And so we just want to continue the conversation. And I really want to get to this question around education, educational setting. So if the panelists, if you'd be, so kind to talk to us about, how cultural and spiritual dehumanization show up in educational settings. Was it necessary to have this discussion, like within the context of schools, and how you see that playing out in the educational setting in your work?
I'd like to respond to Duta. I think talking about assimilation is really important. And yes, I agree that it's a way of really trying to dehumanize our youth. A response to that for us as an organization in working with schools has been to teach acculturation. So allowing the youth to not assimilate necessarily in order to survive, but to acculturate in a healthy way, that they're able to bring elements and value systems and protective factors from their own culture and family into their school setting. Here in Arizona, about 10 years ago, there was a ban on ethnic studies. House Bill 2281 specifically prohibits schools from teaching ethnic studies to our youth, further exasperating the issue with our Latinos.
Mm-hmm. I would say too, Claudia, good friend, the brother Curtis Acosta up there in Arizona, doing that work, around that. But again, I think in school, it's the place where, our children go. And there's a difference between schooling and education. And what has taken place under Western civilization's form of going to school is schooling for compliance, schooling for not critical thinking. And what I think what we're all talking about in this panel, I'm sure it'll come out, is education for liberation. That's been our mantra, our people's mantra as Black people, as brown people, from the time someone said you have to go to school. And see, the thing about it is the thirst historically for education, was even when from the belly of the ship and the slaves landed, there was this thirst to learn, the thirst to learn to read. One of my heroes, one of my giants is Frederick Douglass. Now, I don't know if I can use any swears, but I'll say anyhow, Frederick Douglass got his ass whooped and still said, if he's gonna whip my ass, I'm gonna still learn to read. Because, he saw that power in literacy for freedom, freedom for literacy. And so all throughout the time immemorial, it's been about learning. Now, it was Zora Neale Hurston who said, I can make something of the children. I see the essence of greatness in them. And see, what I think is important for us is to make sure we see the essence of greatness in all our children, and to make sure that as educators, as woke, liberated educators, as conscious educators, that we are right on the front lines to make sure that we inoculate them. I use this term inoculation against the virus of dehumanization, because my mother inoculated me. Little did I know she was putting that needle of inoculation for my cultural relevance. So even the theme of this talk, return to myself, I felt I never left, because I had a mother who kept inoculating me at age 5 by reciting Mother to Son to me by Langston Hughes. I didn't know the power of that poem until later on, the power that it was about building resilience, the power of making sure that I never turned back. But she was kept pumping to me. And we also remember that Black folks in slavery and post-slavery, when they talked about wanting to be somebody, they wanted to be seen as human, because they weren't seen as human. So when you heard the term, I want to be somebody, or when you go to school, go off and be somebody, that's to be seen as being human. So I think that this whole notion of being inoculated and inoculating our young people, from the home, the work that Zakiya is doing, parents, and has to transfer into the school on how we lead. Can we show the video, which is one form of inoculation that it comes back from 1968 when Bill Cosby was leading a program called Black History Lost, Strayed, and Stolen. And you'll see an example in this short clip of a teacher, Black male teacher, inoculating preschool Black boys and girls of preschool age. So if we could show that, it'd give you an example of, kind of what I'm referring to when I'm talking about this inoculation process.
The children are being given a black preparation before they enter the city's schools. They're not especially gifted children, they're just from the neighborhood. One black man named John Churchville put it all together and financed it himself.
Right? You understand that? Yeah. All right. A number is a concept of quantity or an amount. That is wrong. No. A number is a concept of quantity or an amount. That is dead wrong.
He's not only teaching new math to children whose ages range from 17 months to 5 years, he's decided to give them the emotional armor they need to protect themselves against the education they're sure to receive when they start kindergarten.
Anybody tells you something wrong, are you going to do it?
No!
All right. What do you want, Janelle?
I want freedom.
When do you want it?
I want my freedom now.
No, you have to wait till next week, Janelle. You can't have it now. How can you wait till next week?
Yes.
Okay. Sit down. All right, young man, stand up. When do you want your freedom, young man?
I want freedom now.
You can wait till next week, though, can't you?
No.
Michael, you just have to wait till next week. You can't have it now. Are you willing to wait till next week?
No.
Suppose I said that you have to wait till next week. Now, you're going to wait till next week, aren't you?
No.
That was amazing. Thank you. I'm sure the viewers really appreciate that.
And so just to complete, Robbie, the only thing I wanted to close out with is this. That's one example. And then you think if that happened community-wide, right? If that would have happened, unfortunately, we have to do it. Whether the Village of Wisdom, the parents, we have to make sure that our young people are inoculated to know who they are. Because when they know their self, they know their identity. When they know the story, they know their power. You can't strip that away. When you know your story and your power, you can't strip that away.
Thank you so much. That was powerful. Other panelists, kind of how do you see cultural and spiritual dehumanization show up in educational settings in the context of schools?
Yeah, I don't know if it's good for me to jump in right here. Everybody hear me okay?
Yes. Hear you great.
Cool. I was having some technical difficulties, y'all, but I'm glad to be here. I think, Howard lifts this up, and I just want to kind of put this into context for folks in that oftentimes, so I'll tell y'all a story real quick. So I remember walking into a school that was 50% Black and 50% Latinx. And I walked into one of the math classes, and on the wall, it had like a series of pictures, and above the pictures, it said major math contributors over since the beginning of time or something like that, right? And so when I look on the wall, and it's dating back to like maybe the year 1000 or something like that, and every one of the pictures, and it was probably like 15 pictures, were of white men. And so what that does in a school that again was 50% Black and 50% Latinx is it tells children that they don't necessarily have a voice or an intellectual contribution to the situation of math, right? And so a lot of times we're asking ourselves like, well, why aren't students achieving in these classrooms? And the thing I would say, and this kind of point, this is, the point that Ron just brought up, which is we aren't inviting our children in, and we're not necessarily highlighting the intellectual contributions of the people from their past, right? And so, yes, Village of Wisdom has been about the work of increasing the racial socialization or increasing the positive messages that Black parents transmit to their children so that we can inoculate them from their experiences in schools. But also, if we're talking about disrupting dehumanization at systemic levels, then we need to think about what does it mean to turn schools into culturally affirming learning environments for all kids, especially kids of color, especially kids that come from Black, Indigenous, and brown backgrounds, right? And so that's why I think it's so key that not only because this is the analogy I use all the time, if you come to a lake and all of the fish are dead,
then you shouldn't blame the fish for dying, right? Like the water is dirty, right? And so that school created a classroom that had dirty water inside of that math class. So that's why we have to spend so much time inoculating our children. But that isn't necessarily fair. We have to kind of pursue systemic changes to clean the water so that our kids can actually learn in environments that are conducive and environments to their background.
You know, I will say other ways that schools are, and school communities are dehumanizing to students and families is by their policies and practices. You know, I know in some schools, in some charter schools, and in some district schools, there are actually policies that prevent parents from coming to check on their children. There's things like, well, you have to call and make an appointment. It's like their kids have been kidnapped for 8 hours out of the day. It's absolutely ridiculous. However, those same policies you won't find in a community, in a suburban community, or in a community like I live now in Montgomery County, Maryland. There's open door policies. Parents can, you know, kind of come check on their kids, especially younger kids. I've known that parents, you know, will want to check on their younger babies who are in kindergarten or first grade, you know, just, you know, doing an observation, making sure they're good. But in some district schools, in some cities, some charter schools, they will call police on parents if they show up without an appointment. That's absolutely ridiculous. Those are ways in which that you are looking at a particular population based on race, gender, and frankly, socioeconomic status. And you're making these policies and practices in a way in which that you're communicating to these children and to their families that they don't matter. The other thing that I've noticed in school districts like that, because I've experienced some of these myself, particularly in Dayton, where the children are all in uniforms, they're required to line up. You know, Duta said the same things, like they're still doing that in some school districts. They're required to have silent lunches. Silent lunches. I mean, like, it's almost like the kids, like you said, is just compliance. It's literally, when you talk about the school to prison pipeline, to me, when I hear things like that, or I find out about policies like that, that's also the school to prison pipeline, because guess where else those policies are like? Prison, where you have to wear uniforms, where you're required to line up, you're only able to talk at a certain time of day, or you're not able to talk at all. Recess may not even exist. You may not even have arts. You may not have music. It's absolutely ridiculous. And so some of these districts where it is predominantly Black or Indigenous or Latinx or Latino communities, these are the kind of schools that parents are forced to send their children to. And I think, you know, when we get to the point where it's time to talk about solutions, I will be happy, you know, to share some of the things that I have been working on, some of the things that people in our network at Brightbeam are working on to combat some of these really prison cultivation factories that are also known as schools.
Any other panelists have any thoughts on that particular question? Because it makes me wonder, and I hear you all talking about cultural and spiritual dehumanization and what it's like for our schools and our youth. And I'm wondering, what do you think comes to the minds for others? Like, if we were to ask teachers, principals, like, what do other people think of the cultural and spiritual dehumanization or trauma of your communities? And is that different from what your community would say it is? So do you think they're aligned? Do you think that white principals, even, you know, non-Black principals, like, how do you think people think about cultural and spiritual dehumanization or trauma for these communities? And does it match up with how the people within the community would describe dehumanization and trauma?
Yeah, my thoughts on that. I think about, there's a scholar, Dr. P.B. Wordy, and he's from Oklahoma. He and another gentleman, Michael Yellowbird from North Dakota, thought about what structures are serving and not serving our communities. And then, similar to the concept on multicultural education, is how do you start to undo that? Many people have used different words like decolonization. And so there's the naming of the systems that don't work, right? Like, it's Similar to what Zakiya was talking about, it's like the structures of compliance. And we know that that's a thing for schools, right? Like we know that one systems check mechanism for districts, for state level systems is standardized education, is what your audit reports say. But how are some of these structures and systems situated into the overall mission and vision of the school? And how are you thinking through what I've often heard is racial healing or racial justice, these systems that are aligned to our own set of core values, to our own identities? And how do you make that a tool for your community, which I think is getting closer to what we've often called indigenization. So, and one doesn't have to come before the other, but they're different. The decolonization is naming something that doesn't work, and the indigenization is naming something that works, that comes from your community, that is inherently rooted in your own genius as a community. And I think like that's where we need to think through. I think this is what Zakiya was saying in terms of like the policies. How do you make decisions concerning your budget that's aligned with your core values, that's aligned with your own structures and assumptions? Because our communities have made these different decisions and these different thought processes. I wouldn't say that it's foreign, right? Like we're taught in schools that our communities are not organized, or our communities are not strategic, or we're not X, Y, or Z. But if we go back into our history and look at the actual things that happened in terms of the genius of our own sustainability and resilience, our communities have done these things. And so the same way that we remove our students from these concepts and values is the question of how do we bring them back? And I think it's, how do we maintain a non-paternalistic view of this while also lifting up those same structures that our communities have always had? I believe that. I believe that these structures, the idea of excellence, the idea of strategy, the idea of organization is not an inherently Western or white concept. These things, but the context is, right? Like the context in which we're learning it is. And so how do we reclaim, how do we humanize those parts of us that have been dehumanized?
And I would also follow Brother Duta saying schools as currently designed are designed to do exactly what they're doing. We shouldn't expect anything else. That's the reason why, during post-slavery, they had freedom schools that were teaching and talking about excellence. Now, this whole notion of excellence has been something that has been deeply rooted in Black folks and brown folks forever. But suddenly, we get, as Malcolm said, hoodwinked, right? Led astray, run amok, to think that being intelligent is acting white. So the whole notion of what was embedded in our people about being excellent and intelligent, how do we create those pyramids in Africa? How do we do the things that we did? But we suddenly got waylaid to thinking that being smart is acting white. So part of the narrative is the work we have to do as educators, both woke white educators and woke Black educators, because all Black ain't woke either, to really start to debunk those kinds of stereotypes that's been part of this narrative that keeps our kids shackled in what they're shackled in. So I think, the IQ test. I mean, if I had to go by that, I would never be where I am, because it doesn't measure what it's supposed to measure. But all these kinds of systems that's in place to take us and meander us off track, it's what we have to challenge. So I think it has to be the 21st century freedom school model to break the back of dehumanization.
I think working collaboratively is really important to Black, Brown, Indigenous communities. I think about this question of what do schools, what do educators think, what does the community think? I can name 6 Latino cases against schools that have happened since from 1931 to 1987 between California, Mexico, Texas, and where are we now? So the work needs to continue. There's so much advocacy that has happened, needs to continue to happen. And I think we're stronger together. Of course, understanding that we all have unique cultural value systems and things that we bring forward. But I really believe that the concept of a village that Forward Promise provides and reinforces is so important as we try to move this work forward and advocate for change. And a large part of that is education, educating the people that are at the table who are making these decisions so that they are making informed decisions and decisions that are right for the youth of our community.
And I would just add, like, there's also this fundamental thing that we don't talk about a lot when we talk about learning, which is like learning is the activity. Like if you break down the learning science of it, it is the activity of connecting new information to prior knowledge. So if we think about what Duta was talking about previously about like this connection of like our own wisdom, our own organizational skills, our own like genius that we bring to the classroom, when we force Black, Brown, and Indigenous children to assimilate to whiteness, we rob them of the prior knowledge that they need to connect to new information. And so I think our educators really have to understand that, one, you can't disrupt the fundamental resource that Black, Brown, and Indigenous kids bring to the classroom, which is their culture. And so that's a big reason why we see these achievement disparities, is because we're asking kids to make connections to cultures that aren't there. And so that means that inherently they can't tap into their genius. And so now they're not going to be able to give us what they want to give us or what we actually need from them, right? Because we need these children to help us find a liberatory society, right? But as long as we continue to ask folks to assimilate to this whiteness, we won't be able to access their genius, and kids aren't going to be able to access their genius in the fullness of. If they do it in spite of the system, right? And so that's the thing that a lot of times I see kind of missing from the conversations, is that we talk about a lot of things, but a lot of times we don't actually talk about the literal things that are happening inside of the classrooms where the kids are supposed to learn. And if you disrupt their culture, if you tell them their culture isn't worth it, if you tell them culture that their culture is ghetto, if you try to kill the Indian and save the man, like all of those things are not allowing kids to access a basic fundamental action of connecting their prior knowledge, their culture, to this new information that you're trying to share with them.
The other thing I'll add to, amen, first of all, William, absolutely. The other thing that what you described does to young people, Black, Brown, and Indigenous young people in particular, is it tells them that they're inferior. It socializes them to believe that they're less than, that their families and their communities are primitive, or whatever other kind of horrible adjective, will just come up for them. Like the example that you gave of a young person walking into a classroom and all the great mathematicians happen to be white men. Like that's a very subtle socialization that as Black people, some Black folks say, white is right and all this other kind of stuff, but a white man's ice is colder. I mean, we've heard all these things kind of growing up, as Black folks in this country. And one of the things that I think that we have to be about the business of doing is not just inoculating, but also building parallel systems. Like shout out to NACA, right? Like that's what we need. That's like one of the solutions is like that we actually have a choice not to continue to send our children into these harmful situations. We should be, creating parallel systems or systems, African-centered schools in a lot of places. I know here in DC, one of the oldest African-centered schools, has been around over 50 years. Same in Chicago. I had an opportunity to have Dr. Carol Lee on with me last week talking about education for liberation. And I brought her on because she's a shining example. Her and her husband, Hakeem Matabuti, some folks may know who they are, Third World Press, where they built these parallel systems. Here she is, she worked at a university level at Northwestern, but she built Black-led institutions in the community to serve the community. And that to me, I believe what we have to be about at the same time while making the larger structures less dehumanizing and more equitable for our children.
And I think if I can build on that too, again, Zakiya and William, I think it's also incumbent upon us to really be literate in the literacy that has come from Haki and Carol Lee and Gloria Ladson Billings. You know, there's a whole canon of things that our educators, black or white, should know about, but don't, you know, and, you know, to really immerse them in, which says a lot about what happened in college as well, preschool, in college and universities. I happen to be blessed to go to Lincoln University, the Lincoln University of Pennsylvania, Langston Hughes, Thurgood Marshall, Kwame Nkrumah, you know, so I was immersed in that, which is what we want to replicate and can replicate, you know. And I would say that if in fact, because I like the option of being able to go to a liberation school or a citizen school, as Septima Clark talked about, but if in fact that can't happen, you know, what must we do inside of the four walls that is named after Ida B. Wells or Thurgood Marshall? Because many of those schools that's named after these iconic people don't have iconic stuff going on.
Very much so, very much so. Thank you all. That was some heavy things have been mentioned. You had some questions in the comments, and Matt, I see your question, Matt Green, but I think that's a good question for us to hold until the solutions portion of the conversation. And so we'll definitely bring your question back up. And I just, you know, acknowledge Beth's comment about that there's lots of inequality in wanting the organizations, including state departments, to take the next step beyond a statement for equality or equity and see the examination of policies and practices, which is very, very important. And I think all the things we've talked about, cultural and spiritual dehumanization and ways to keep our spirits and our strength in doing this work, you know, we want to include that by modeling that for our audience and our community. And so we have Dr. Phil, I call Dr. Phil because I love her, Dr. Phyllis Hubbard, who was gonna, you know, take us through some stretches and it gives opportunity to like recenter and breathe a bit based on all of the heavy things that we've done. And we're gonna come back with the results from a poll question after we've stretched. So as you're stretching and you're going through the exercise with Dr. Hubbard, I just want you, the audience, to think about the question around, like, after listening to the presentation and the conversation so far, have you learned things about your community or other communities, or both your community and others, that you didn't know before? And if you could just put some of the lessons that you've learned so far in the chat box, and we can kind of like breathe and meditate over those things as Dr. Phyllis Hubbard introduces herself and then takes us through some recentering through stretch and breathing. So I'm gonna pass the mic to Dr. Hubbard.
Thank you so much. It's just such a pleasure to be in the presence of people I love so dearly. And so, as you all know, sitting is the new smoking. And so it's incredibly important that you actively engage in your own self-care. So I invite you all, where you are, to stand up so that we can do a quick stretch and a quick breather that helps us return to ourselves. I love the concept of returning to ourselves. And so we're going to stand up and tuck the tailbone under, pull the shoulders up, back and down. And we're going to open up the space between the vertebrae and the spine. It's really important after 40 minutes of sitting, you know, that we get up and stretch, you know, and this is important to do as we're sheltering in place. So let's breathe in and lift the arms up overhead. And as we exhale, relax our shoulders down. We're going to breathe in, reach up, opening the space between the vertebrae. And as we exhale, we're going to ease our way to the left. We breathe in, reach up. Exhale, ease our way to the right. I'm doing the opposite of what I say. We breathe in, reach up. And as we exhale, we're going to lower the hands down and we're going to place our palms over the heart. You identify as female, left palm on top. If you identify as male, right palm on top. If you do not identify at all, go with the palm that feels right to you. And what we're going to do is place our palms on the left side of the chest. We're going to practice an exercise that helps us return to ourselves. And as we breathe slowly and deeply in and out, we're going to just take a moment to be silent and to listen for the sound and to track the feeling of our heartbeat. Breathing slowly and deeply in and out. Tracking the sound and the feeling of the heartbeat. Doesn't matter where it is, just notice where it is. And it's just a brief way of being able to tap in to the truest part of yourself. And then take a breath in. And as you exhale, slowly lower the hands down. And when you're ready, if your eyes are closed, you can slowly open your eyes. Thank you so much. Take care, be well, and be radiant.
Hello, welcome back, everyone. I hope that we are stretched, feel recentered and regrounded. And you got a chance to breathe, answer the polling question. Again, you're, wanting to know what have you learned so far in this first segment as we transition to our solution segment. Our panelists gave us a lot of information about how cultural dehumanization shows up in our schools. And so we're really interested in kind of, what you think what you've learned in the first half of our conversation thus far. Again, thank you to Dr. Hubbard for taking us through that really great stretch. She's come to visit us at Forward Promise many times, and I'm still working on my warrior breathing on days where I'm stressed. So she's amazing. I really appreciate her work. So as we think about what we've talked about in the first half, if you can talk a little bit about some strategies that you've identified in your own work or communities to disrupt cultural and spiritual dehumanization. How might you've been doing that work in your own work in your communities for our panelists?
We look specifically at Latino risk and protective factors when working with our boys and young men. So I think I mentioned this earlier, but and William, you spoke to this, but making sure that they're not being stripped of their inherent strengths, not just their own, but those of their culture and their people and their relations. So there's actually a resource that I can share about the risk and protective factors with the group. And I can tell you that it's been very successful in the work in terms of direct services with our families here in the community. And making sure that what you do includes, for Latino families, includes engaging the whole family holistically, whoever the caregiver is, whether it's mom, dad, sister, uncle, nana, because for Latinos, that kind of engagement helps the youth more long-term. And so it's sustainable in that regard. But definitely looking at protective factors and risk factors. And I can share that resource. You can share it with the group.
So one of the other things that I think is important is also narrative change, even as another form of inoculation. I've been very attracted to the work, particularly around Black men and boys. Dr. Tommy J. Curry, formerly of Texas A&M, now over at Edinburgh in the UK. He has written a book, a seminal book called The Man Not, that really gets down deep into the historical legacy that many, the historical dehumanization legacy in this country, particularly that how it impacts Black men and boys, and also challenges even our current academia and some of the liberal arts and some of the narratives coming even out of academia that discusses and talks about Black men and boys from a deficit perspective that's also very harmful. So one of the things that's extremely important to me, raising a young Black man and also married to a Black man, is that we challenge, these harmful narratives that are often created and perpetuated that creates the conditions, in my opinion, for the George Floyds of the world, right? When you have a narrative about, on Twitter, I think at some point there was this hashtag, a literal hashtag that said Black men are trash. I find that very harmful. And sometimes it comes from people who you would think would be allies because they're liberal in other areas, but talk about Black men in a way that is completely dehumanizing. And I think that we have to be able to find ways intracommunally to hold one another accountable without also being dehumanizing to the humanity and the character of our people. And so I would certainly, encourage folks to check out Dr. Curry's work. He's there's a burgeoning field of actual study in the academy called Black Male Studies that would lend some more actual credibility with actual data, with actual statistics, instead of things that are not actually rooted in data, but actually rooted in people's perceptions or people's hurt feelings or whatever it is that describes and dehumanizes Black men and boys, particularly in this age of social media. And I am very cognizant, even of my 13-year-old, that 3-year-old is now a 13-year-old here in 2020. So I'm very cognizant, unfortunately, about the kind of social media interaction my son has, because I don't want him to run into these kind of harmful narratives and think that way about himself.
Yes. So I'll share a few things that we're doing, Coalition of Schools Educating Boys of Color. I think the first thing I would encourage the viewers to do is to follow us on cosbach.org. We are deeply committed, as I said, by no accident, the affirmative development of boys, young men of color, their social, emotional, cultural development. And signature for us is our rite of passage program that we have conducted in school districts and in schools, because as Zakiya mentioned, the strengthening of the identity has got to be the #1 priority. We have a mantra that we recite, and I'll just say it to you: sharpen your eyes, tune your ears, so you know what you see, understand what you hear, minute by minute, hour by hour. As we know our story, we know our power. So that's part and parcel. That's from Listevelt Middleton. And so, these kind of daily affirmations to start the school day, you can start at home reciting that, but having schools with that culture in mind, builds that, as we say in the spiritual medicine, that identity does matter. And as I said earlier, really recognizing whether we call it genius. I've been latched on to the word vibranium since, that there's vibranium in our Black and brown boys and young men. And it's up to us to make them, enable them to see it. There's a book that I'm going to refer to everybody. It's called Freedom's Design. I don't know if you can see it. 20 Days of Empowering Black Kings. Because one of the things, and this is by Brian Harris, a short read, but has daily affirmations. You know, so I mean, I'd have this if I'm a parent, but I'd have this in my desk if I'm a teacher. You know, make sure that we're lifting up daily the affirmation in an affirmative way, the identity and strength of our boys and young men and our girls and young women as well. At the same time, I recommend that we read this dated book, okay? Disrupting the Conspiracy to Destroy Black Boys by the scholar, right, Jawanza Kunjufu. It might be on a lot of people's shelves and they haven't read it. So I think, again, going back to those things that, and this one here also, Young, Gifted, and Black. Scholars wrote Asa Hilliard, Teresa Perry, Claude Steele. You know, that kind of constant immersion into those things that have worked for generations. And I would also steer you to a poem by Carol Lee's husband, Haki Mathabudi, that we use quite often. It's called the Book of Life. And if you know the Book of Life, if you have your students read that, if you have the faculty read that, it extols what we know we can see, you know, and it doesn't make Black Wall Street an anomaly. It's the norm, you know, it's Wakanda. You know, this is what we do. We do it well. And finally, Kozbach Standards, which is our core document. We call it Standards, the Uncommon Core, because we know in school, the Common Core has been used to determine what students should know, be able to do, but it's not culturally proficient. So the Kozbach Standards, we call the Uncommon Core, because it talks about the things that are not talked about in some of the standardized metrics and models that we use across the country.
I would throw in, Rabiatu, that when I think about cultural and spiritual resources, I think about anything that could affect your body, mind, heart, and soul. And so in this sense that we think about young people and communities of color, the very cultural and spiritual aspects that we can see are resident in all those four spaces. I grew up in the AME church, in which you couldn't really think about your spirituality without an understanding of its central involvement in the resistance to oppression. When the church was founded on sort of not being able to pray at the altar, that narrative is part of the theology. And so in some respects, how do we live out that theology when we were teaching, inoculating, socializing? In my church, I used to sing a song that, you know, Lord, I'm trying to make 100, 99 and a half won't do. And something about the music and the rhythm of these songs that not only bring us through the words a sense of redemption, but also through the music itself as a healing and soothing us when we are struggling every day to go to work, to get up in the morning, and to get our children ready. When I think about cultural and spiritual resources, the folks in the church used to say, you got to be yourself or you're going to be by yourself. And in that sort of cultural messaging, they're saying, like, you get to lose a lot if you do what Dr. Jackson was describing as what we have to do in shape-shifting ourselves in these educational whiteness spaces, that eventually all of us come to a place where we have to say, as I've said to myself at 30 years of Penn, I belong here, but I do not fit in. And because of that, everywhere I own, the Creator has given me the space to belong, even if the others around me do not accept my difference. And I think part of the inoculation, part of the socialization has to appreciate in our children that you're going to go into spaces where other people, where you don't fit in, but you belong there because the Creator allows that. And then I'll sort of end in the sense around, I believe in the world of prayer as a form of mindfulness, and that we underestimate the power of prayer as getting our health and our bodies and our souls in spaces that we often attribute to what people call now as mindfulness, but has been for centuries thought of as contemplative prayer. Jerry Teo's book, The Recovering Your Sacredness, I would strongly recommend as a wonderful treatise on how to connect cultural traditions back to who we are. And in that sense, the last thing I will say is that culture also relates to how we move, our very style, how we speak, our attitude. You know, that's the styles that bring us to a place of being who we are. We can teach our young people that there's nothing wrong with your attitude. There's nothing wrong with the way you want to impress and speak your voice, right? So as much as we're inoculating, we also got to be helping our young people to be agentic in the styles that come most natural to them.
Amen. Amen.
It's amazing.
Yeah, I would also, since Dr. Stevenson was just talking, I would lift up a lot of his work. Dr. Stevenson has done immense work in the space of racial socialization, and a lot of, I would say, his comrades or peers, Dr. Enrique Neblett, Dr. Stephanie Core was the first person who actually did an intervention specifically for Black parents in terms of encouraging racial socialization. Dr. Stevenson has a play model for encouraging socialization. So I think we have to kind of look back at the research and the people who talk about this work and who spent a lot of time kind of actually explicitly giving frameworks for socialization and how to racially affirm children. I'd also call out our work. So we've created something called the Black Genius Planning Process that is available on our website. You can get at it through villageofwisdom.org or blackgenius.com. You'll see a note in the top right corner that says Black Genius Planning, or on blackgenius.com, it's on the left-hand side, but you'll be able to navigate to it. And what it does, and we need more of these tools, we need tools that help Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, if they're gonna have to be in schools with 80, 70% white teachers, communicate to those teachers who they are and what their genius is. Because unfortunately, right now, too many of our kids sit in the classrooms of white teachers who don't know their cultures, who don't really know where to start at, and don't have a really good idea of how to integrate it, right? And so, yes, we need to be kind of shifting our systems. And we also need to be weakening the system by giving some folks this opportunity to see children through an affirmative and an affirming lens. And we really encourage parents to fill it out with their students so that they drive that to the teacher. And what we're looking for teachers to do is to find ways to integrate that Black genius that the family has presented to them into their instructional decisions. Because at the end of the day, these instructional decisions are what's determining whether or not that child actually has the access and the ability to learn at the end of the day. And then some people might be asking themselves, well, what does cultural affirmation look like and culturally responsive look like? Well, we took the Black Genius framework, which we literally took from the wisdom of Black parents. Like we say, our work is about translating the wisdom of Black parents. If folks were kind of early. And what we did is we literally created a survey that Black, Brown, and Indigenous and whatever students can actually take to evaluate whether or not they're in a culturally affirming environment or not. And we call that the culturally affirming climate survey. And so it's available for anybody who has students from 7th to 12th grade. And it'll actually give you a metric to see like, okay, am I doing it? Do my students actually feel like they're in a culturally affirming learning environment? And the really sweet thing for us is that the framework that we created was based off the wisdom of Black parents, right? So at the end of the day, what I think we all need to be kind of moving towards is, do the parents of these children actually vouch for this being a validated learning environment for our children, right? Because at the end of the day, who's a better kind of steward of the culture of their children, right? Like we know our own cultures, we know what kind of environment we're raising our children in. And so we need to trust families and communities more to have the power to kind of say, actually, you're not hitting it. That I wouldn't validate as a Black genius protected classroom.
Powerful.
That's powerful, Will. Thank you. Before we move to the breathing, we had, taken a poll. We just want to check in with the audience on like how you feel, what you feel like you've learned and gleaned from the session thus far. And so, we're going to go ahead and put those poll results up to see what you've done here. And it's actually kind of difficult for me to see. So a lot of people have learned a lot about other communities, which is amazing, right? And it's great that you're here. Hopefully you're an educator, you work with youth. And so if you learned a lot about other communities that you didn't know before, that you can apply this knowledge, at least the awareness a little bit, and it can encourage you to go look. Ron gave us lots of books to read. And for those who didn't know, it's National Literacy Day. So perfect to go find a book to read. And that you wouldn't normally read. And so I encourage you to do that. We had one audience question which kind of speaks to that, which I would like actually the panel to address. Kind of like on the point of what Will said of like, the parent should be the one certifying, is this, you know, a classroom that does Black genius well, right? Like the parent should be the ones can affirm that. So maybe Claudia, you can address this question first. So the question is, how for many teachers, especially white teachers, the concept of spirit is severed from identity and limited to aspects of religion. How do we build this critical consciousness with teachers?
I go back to my original comment is education, and not just formal education, but educating these teachers in the ways of our people. And I'm not sure what that could look like. I'm sure that if we engage that way, the teachers have a substantial amount of learning to do. And that's just anyone going into these schools with this experience can tell you that. But definitely the educators, the people who are working with our youth need to be taught the ways culturally of our people. And when that doesn't happen, then we're looking at the status quo, and the status quo is not working. So really getting in there and engaging those individuals. And unfortunately, sometimes that has to come top down. You know, in my opinion, the best work is done grassroots, bottom up, but it would take someone at a leadership level saying to the teachers, you've got to do this. This is important in order to truly give the children an appropriate environment culturally in the learning process.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Will.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, and I just want to build on what we just said, which is we have to put structures in place, accountability structures in place inside of schools that allow for parents and communities to have power over essential education decisions, right? I'll say that again, like we have to put accountability structures inside of schools that allow for parents and communities to have power over essential education decisions. And until we have these types of feedback mechanisms, these types of accountability structures, then we will continue in this pathway. So we want it to be top down, but we also want this to be more communal, right? And so what does it look like for a parent to be a part of a community participatory evaluation board inside of the school that is evaluating whether or not the teachers are actually creating culturally affirming learning environments? So, and I'm not just talking about this stuff, like literally Rabbi right now is helping us train parents in our community to evaluate and gather from our community who and what does culturally affirming learning look like in a virtual space and in at-home learning spaces, right? And then we're going to lift those ideas up. We're going to lift those strategies up, and we're actually going to test those strategies to see whether or not they work. I think the thing is that like somehow whiteness and we talked about this earlier, but like whiteness has tried to like co-opt the idea of excellence and measurement, right? And the reality is that we came up with that stuff. Like our communities came up with these things. Like we had our own structures for this, for ideas of excellence and for measuring and all these other things. And so, what I'm saying is that at the end of the day, what does it look like for us to create structures that allow for parents and communities to actually hold schools accountable, right, to the things that they need to do? And we know that we can do that if we push schools to really think about institutional structures that involve parents in decision-making in meaningful ways.
Absolutely.
I think just to add to
Yep.
If I may, just to add to what you're saying, Will, I think the other paradigm shift that must be shifted is the fact that we think school has to be the center of all learning. School is a part of the community. Too oftentimes we make it the center of the community. So there's other learning spaces that should be validated. And particularly when I was principal, I used to, I don't say deputize, or I used to say to my parents that you're part of my community faculty. You may not have, a degree from what school, but you're a faculty member. I used to go to the barbershops. You're a faculty member. Go to the grocery stores. You're a faculty member. So I think, again, making this transition, not to say that school has to be the entry point for all learning and knowledge, because it's not. It takes place all throughout the community. How do we weave it together? And I would also use 3 words, too, that's very important for the parent, family, and school connection. It's 3 simple words. And, my good friend, and some of you may know her, Karen Mapp, also always talks about it. 1, you got to welcome folks, whether it's in the school building or the community center. You've got to have that sense of welcome. I've got to feel as though when I come to Will's house, Will's going to offer me some chicken and some tea or something. I'm feeling welcome coming in this door. Number 2, after the welcome comes the honor. That Brother Duta has assets that he's willing to give up that I didn't know until I said, Duta, what do you think about this? And he starts pouring out all these assets. So once we have the welcome and the honoring of the assets, the 3rd word is that Duta is going to join me in the enterprise of educating his or her son. So I think sometimes we overcomplexify something that's not needing to be so complicated, but because of these policies and procedures. And then I think the last thing I'm going to just mention, Howard brought in a very, very important word, which we don't often talk about, except when we're in our own spaces of comfort. That's faith. In order to do this work, you got to believe in something. I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. You mentioned Duta, and I wanted to ask specifically about the Native American Community Academy, and that it's a school that holds culture at its core, and kind of why is it so important to the young people that you serve, and what are you doing different from other schools? What does your school do differently from a traditional school, or even schools that say they're kind of culturally relevant or culturally affirming? How does your academy differ from what those schools might do?
Yeah, I think, so the fundamental shift in my mind is that our school was created out of the voice of the community. And though there are positions at the school, like head of school or executive director or dean of students, that ultimately the accountability lies in what the community asked us to do 15 years ago. And this has connection back decades and centuries, if you will. And the mission of the school, which is to create a community that is working together so that the students are academically prepared, secure in their identity, and healthy, was a result of dozens and dozens of conversations prior to the inception, prior to the opening of the school. And I think that is really an honor, paying honor and really acknowledging that the questions that are circulating around the idea of education and schooling are not new ones. And they're actually questions that our ancestors have asked for a long time. The context in which we are operating a school is relatively new. And it is a result of an evolution of since the inception of the school. And I think that the context and I appreciate that the remembering of freedom schools and what is the product of the evolution of that time, and how are freedom schools, survival schools still present today. And I think they're through the organizations and schools that we're all a part of. And I think, and another extension of kind of the question that you're asking is also like, how are we not teaching our students in our community and our families to be academically, culturally literate, but to know it through practice, to know it through experience, knowing that not all of our students have access in the same way that another would. And so one student might be totally plugged into their ceremonies. They may be a singer within a society. They may be part of a certain clan, and that they're, you know, day in, day out, that's their regular practice. While another student may be for the first time realizing where their ancestors come from and are really, you know, like maybe able to speak their language for the first time. And so, like, how do we acknowledge the place by which a student and a family enters the conversation around identity and culture, and not be paternalistic about what that means, right? Like, to say that this is what it means to be your tribe and who you are, but allow, you know, invoke the expeditionary learning that requires a student to like explore that for themselves. And then how do we plug in pieces, you know? So like the fundamental shift that we have at the school is that we don't have social studies or reading. We have Indigenous history and Native literature. And even the shift in the name is small, but it's large in the paradigm of how students are thinking about their own education. Each quarter, a student will fill out a wellness wheel that is about the physical wellness, the intellectual wellness, the social, emotional, and the community and relationship wellness. And then they use that as a mechanism for a student-led conference to say, like, this is how my grades are, but that's only one quadrant of who I am as a student. And so, like, being able to shift it into like the social, emotional learning, the spiritual, the identity learning, and how do we fundamentally change this, right? And then at what point do these same students who are experiencing these schools find their way into leading these schools, right? Like, I should not have a job at the school for 30 years. I've been there 15, and someone needs to one of our alumni need to step into that, because they're experiencing an education system that I didn't. I still went through a school structure that it was primarily dominated by whiteness, and that was on and off where, you know, the reservation where I grew up. So I think, you know, and then the last thing I think is just the structures, right? You come to NACA, you'll start the day with a morning blessing. You may hear one of our students sing. You may hear them offer a blessing in their language. Maybe they're offering a poem, some words of encouragement. But there's the intentional start, which is a fundamental practice across many of our different tribes. So it's shifting also the social and the formal practices of the school as well.
Nice. Thank you so much for that.
I wanted to hop in a little bit just really quickly because I love the fact that William brought up the idea of power and parents actually having power in the education of their children. And one of the things that I would be remiss not to bring up is the fact that when parents do organize to exert some power, particularly when it comes to changing particular dehumanizing and harmful and anti-Black policies and procedures, there's a tension there. And I will tell you, especially in states, I'm not sure if this is the case in North Carolina, but I can tell you that in Ohio and Maryland, teachers have unions that are very powerful. And oftentimes, teachers and their unions don't have the same ideas about justice when it comes that parents and families have, and parents and students have. And we saw historically, if folks are familiar with the Black and Puerto Rican families who fought in New York City and actually did take over the schools in their community, the largest teacher strike in history happened under Al Shanker in New York as a response to Black and Puerto Rican families. Okay, so we have to think about this in a way where we are also fighting systems and structures, but sometimes we're also having to look at the ways in which teachers themselves and in their unions, unfortunately similar to the FOP, are actually harmful to our people. They're harmful to our children and harmful to, you know, our families when it comes to dehumanization. I can tell you from direct experience, when we were organizing to end preschool suspensions, Preschool, y'all. Preschool suspensions and expulsions. It was the teachers union in Dayton, Ohio, who was our biggest opponent. When you think about how they showed up at meetings and the kinds of things the horrible things that they said about our babies, 3 to 5 years old, calling them little rapists, all kinds of things. I am not making this up, y'all. This is my experience. And so this is something that I have often had to struggle with, even now as a parent. And, you know, I have to apologize really quickly because I will have some background noise. We've actually had to hire an educator, hire a teacher for my daughter because she's 6 years old, right? She would have been in first grade. My husband and I decided we had to do what was best for her and unenrolled her from the public schools because guess what? In Montgomery County, Maryland, one of the wealthiest districts in the whole nation, went with the power of the teachers union and decided, even though that this district has the resources, I believe, to have school in a safe way, we didn't. And there was no really interaction with parents and with particularly working class parents who still have to work on whether virtual learning only would actually work for them or whether it will work for the children. So a lot of times parents and students, we don't actually have any power with how education, at least in the current system, is done for our kids. If we happen to be middle class, then we have to still pay our taxes to the system, but then also for us, hire an educator to make sure that our children get the education that they need. So there's a lot of different nuances that I just want to, you know, help people understand that it's not as easy as you think it would be, and especially for folks who've worked in education. If you work in a union state, you know how difficult it can be.
I'd like to offer a model that Amistades uses to work to build power with parents and families. It's called Rasología, and Maestro Roberto Vargas developed this when he was studying at Berkeley. And Rasología is a 4-part model, and it starts with conocimiento, which is relationship building, and then it goes to confianza, which is trust. And then the third step is unidad, which is unity. And the last step is poder, which is power. This is something that we've used to engage parents and help build power so that they can have an impact in the lives of their children. And Amistades has so much to offer in this regard. We've served as an intermediary so many times for parents who don't feel comfortable talking to schools, who don't feel comfortable talking to educators. So there is a way to do this effectively. And Rasología is a model that has worked very, very well for us. So I just want to acknowledge Maestro Roberto Vargas, and he's allowed us to use this.
You know, in Forward Promise, you know, Howard and Rhonda, something that Claudia said, and she kind of reverberated what Zakiya said, I think what William said, what Brother Duta said, is that, you know, the collaboration that's essential, you know, cross-cultural collaboration, the cross-cultural connections is critical for us changing the paradigm and even confronting power, you know. And I think we're able to share these strengths, these tools. As I was listening to Duta, you know, we do something very similar with the young men, you know, rites of passage, is the rituals, is the ciphers, the circles, you know, the healing circles, you know, all those things that makes the day that these young men encounter very different than a normal sort of day. It's affirming, it's lifting up, it's checking value systems, you know, both for the young men and for those who say they're educating the young men. But I think that the Forward Promise bully pulpit to try to really bring these, which you're doing, just sort of really click. I mean, this is what we have to do to really make a difference, I think.
Yeah, we have a collective power amongst us. And, you know, a lot of times the atmosphere in the US can make things seem like things are just black or white. And that, you know, other communities of color sometimes might feel left out or not. But that's, again, kind of the power of colonization and making the people who are all in the same kind of like powerlessness feel they have to like do this tug of war, right? When there's greatness in our unity and our power together, and sharing communalities and celebrating our differences in ways we can all learn to empower one another. So that was something really powerful, Ron. I appreciated that comment about, how can we pool our resources to empower all of our communities. Still want to encourage our viewers to put questions in the chat box. We've only had, a particular comment around, Nancy says that, when our brothers and sisters were stolen from Africa, they changed their names. And so maybe we should start giving our children real African names, if possible, as a suggestion. And we've seen that a lot of communities of color are returning and using the power of names to kind of return power to their families. And so, I think people are starting to do that more. And I think that speaks also kind of like Zakiya, your policy and procedures around how we have documented times of like discriminating people by their names, right? So, where we have communities of color who are trying to protect their children by naming their child Chris or Sean instead of, Jose or Jorge or something else that might make them identify them as who they are racially, and it's kind of reverting to that other way of going back to that. And so, as we have about 20 minutes left, and I really want the panelists to kind of like give final thoughts, what's your takeaway? If people was watching this is the last time that they get to have this conversation, and they're left to go do the rest on their own or find their own collaborations, what would you say they need to do? What do you want them to leave this conversation with? So anybody can start.
So Rabi, there was a comment that was earlier that I actually want to circle back to as a part of me thinking about like, where do we go from here? Beth had talked in the comments about how she wanted to see state departments of education take this next step beyond saying that they're about equity and really examining the policy practices and rules that are in place and how they disempower our children. And she spoke specifically about the combination of non-white and disability and how that creates huge gaps in opportunities to learn for children of color. And I think, it speaks to what Zakiya was talking about earlier, how white supremacy pushes right up against us as we attempt to really make changes to benefit our young people. And so, I think our next webcast is going to get deeper into policy, but, we have to be unafraid to look at these policies and practices and ask the question, what do you really think of us as people of color to really even enable you to enact some of these policies and practices that are being put in place? And what do we need to do to dismantle the way that you think about who we are so that we can create an education system that's more equitable? I think about the fact that our school districts collect civil rights data every year and turn it into the Department of Education, and they do nothing with it because the powers that be really don't care enough to interrogate that data and examine what does it really mean about how I view children of color in my school system because of the way I allow them to be treated. I allow their disabilities to languish in classrooms where they're not being supported. I allow them to sit in schools where they are not getting access to a college readiness curriculum that I say that everybody needs, or I allow them to be suspended from school in droves. What do our decisions actually mean and say about what we think about people of color? And Duta said it as well when he talked about budgets. Do our budgets actually reflect our values? So I feel like one of the next steps is for us to, as those who have voice, to continue to be unapologetic about asking those hard questions. What are you really saying that you feel about people of color by the actions that you put out there every single day in our school buildings?
Well, Rhonda, you said it all. But I think just to follow up, those hard questions, those hard conversations, because the other question I would add to what you just raised, do you really want to change? You know, what is your epiphany point? I mean, at what point would you change? Do you have to be at the edge of the cliff, about to be pushed over before you change to really become equitable and fair-minded, justice-centered, socially compassionate? You know, those are hard questions that we have to sort of organize and frame and reframe and keep saying it collectively, I believe. At the same time, I wonder, after George Floyd and after all the endless names of people who we've lost, does guilt last? No. You know, I mean, you would think that after George Floyd, then you see the next brother or sister. Does it last? You know, so, you know, what does it take for people to see the look in the mirror and not out the window? What will it take? I mean, those profound questions, we need to keep bombarding people. And at the same, and I think it also is incumbent upon to turn it inside within our own communities too. You know, to find where those rough places or spots in our community that need healing. Because at the same time, when we're confronting, we have to be about the healing too. Was Howard said, protection, correction, and affection. You know, we have to be about these things. And this, it takes time, but we got to do it. Now is the time. Tomorrow's too late.
To add what you were saying, Ron and Rhonda, that it's ironic that we have some people in this country who believe that their faith ordains them to separate children from families, to believe that somehow they are better than everybody else, that they were destined to rule and to oppress in the name of some kind of God or some kind of culture or some kind of spirituality. And so we must think of, it pushes us to think of our solutions with that in mind. In some places, when we tried to integrate schools, some communities decided not to have school and shut it down. And so if we understand, and I hear what Zakiya is saying too, that resistance, if we look back historically, and I think as we said last time, as we fight for freedom, others will fight just as hard for us not to have that freedom. As in the words of James Baldwin, who says that our freedom might mean their loss of innocence, the end of innocence. And then how do we create solutions under that kind of context, under that kind of history and narrative? So.
My final words and my thought takeaway is that the power needs to go back to the people, the community, the parents. They are the subject matter experts. They know what is best for their own child, and acknowledging that and creating space within an already oppressive system to acknowledge that is going to be hard work. Still, it should be something that we all work toward.
I mean, I think about, you know, in final words, like I think about Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham jail a lot. I think Rhonda and Ron both kind of talked to this question about what you're willing to do and what we're willing to do, and are people willing to do it? And, you know, and I think, unfortunately, the reality is that there's a lot of people who would count themselves as liberal, count themselves as social justice warriors or woke or whatever. And I think the hardest thing about being woke or being aware, socially conscious, is being aware of how you participate in these systems of injustice, right? How do you forward the power of racism? How do you forward the power of white supremacy? How are we continually examining our actions and our activities to make sure that we're not contributing to the system? Because what I find is oftentimes folks are not willing to recognize when they're contributing to the system. Like, we don't want to call it out, right? Like, for example, like the Black middle class folks, right? People who live a life like mine, right? Like a lot of times we have a hard time talking about the ways that the system may have benefited us, right? And I'm not saying like we get the white supremacy kind of like golden ticket. I'm just saying that there are ways that we might look down on our brothers and sisters through a classist lens, right? And as long as we're not willing to examine our own participation in the dehumanization of our own people, then we contribute to that, right? And that is not to say that we hold the power to completely undo it. I am just saying that we have to look internally, right, to our own participation in this particular system. And the sooner that we realize that we're on a journey, I think if we take that analogy a little bit further, the further that we get towards liberation. And I think right now we got too many people who are caught up in this idea of like trying to show off that they're about to get in a marathon and they got their little placard on saying what number they are in the marathon, and they done posted 18 times on social media saying I'm about to run a marathon, and they doing everything but actually starting to run the marathon, to do the hard work of getting on this journey and getting this thing done. And I think for folks who might be kind of in that moment, like, I just want you to think about that child right now that is not getting the access to the education that they need, right? And how you are dehumanizing a person, right? Like, we are dehumanizing children on a day-to-day basis. We're telling them that they aren't worthy, that they should not be in these classrooms, and we're robbing them of their potential. And the thing for the folks who are egocentric, we're robbing ourselves of their potential. Because if you haven't noticed, like, our world is on fire. Like, we got climate change, we got all these things. We can't handle simple public health issues. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that there's 7 million plus Black children in this country right now, and we can't guarantee that we're going to be able to leverage each and every one of their Black genius, right? There has to be close to 7 million brown kids in this country right now, and we can't guarantee that we're going to leverage their genius. There has to be 1 million probably plus indigenous kids that are in this country right now, and we're not leveraging their genius. And it's because a lot of us aren't really willing to start that journey, the hard work of running a marathon, because that's tiring and it's an everyday thing.
Yeah, so many of what you said, so much that you said, William, really resonates with me. I think, you know, I was at a presentation where someone said, whiteness isn't always about white people. And it shifted for me about the ways in which our own people proliferate whiteness within our structures, which then took me to the thinking that I think a lot of us have been in, right? Of like, if we've created, founded, or built something, either as individuals or as collectives, there is both embedded individual healing and individual journey, as well as collective healing and collective journey. And I wonder at what point our own individual healing takes precedent over the collective healing. And how do you navigate that, right? Like, much of what we've built at NACA is about defining what it is that we want to see because of what we didn't as adults. And then at what point does it become less about iterating into a space of deficit and then iterating into a space of abundance and possibility, innovation, and creativity? And I think for each of us as individuals, there's that kind of journey that we need to understand in terms of where does our own individual healing and the articulation of the work intersect with the collective healing needed for the community and for us as part of that community. And how do we understand that? The last thing that I think is like, how do we acknowledge the work that has always been, right? Like, that the concept of education is not new, though the word that we're using comes from the English language, is that our people have always had systems of proliferating knowledge, understanding, and skills. And how do we acknowledge that in the here and now? And then also pay homage to the folks who have been iterating in a space and have given their bodies, their blood, their tears, their energy, their spirit to this. And what is our responsibility given that I want to put in front of everybody? Because I think, you know, we don't come from weak people. We come from power. We come from genius. And how will we lift that up in the work that we do every day?
Yeah, I appreciate that, Duta. Thank you. We absolutely come from geniuses. We absolutely come from powerful people. And in that spirit, you know, I just want to lift up and center the powerful working class Black mamas and daddies and indigenous mamas and daddies that's figuring this stuff out right now. You hear me? Listen, the way education is evolving in this moment, I gotta end on a positive note, right? We've been talking about all of this Black genius. Black genius has been existing forever. And you're talking about people who figure it out and make a way. That's our legacy, y'all. We make a way out of no way. And I'm thinking about folks that I know personally, my cousins, you know, family members, people who are figuring out, okay, well, now I got to start having a relationship with my neighbor now because I still got to go to work. But this 8th grade boy still got to get on virtual learning. So I got to ask my neighbor to come over and check and make sure this boy is on this virtual learning. I've been hearing so many of those stories now. So many people are connecting in new ways because we have to. We're forced to go back to that communal neighborhood kind of conversations again. Can you help me? Not just borrow some sugar, but can you come over and watch the kids while I do this virtual webcast? I'm literally talking to colleagues that's doing this right now. And so to me, this is indicative of us figuring out in a global pandemic, figuring out how to make sure that our babies can still learn and that we can still try to work and put food on the table. It's certainly not an ideal situation. If we had better leadership, you know, at the government level, at the local, state, and federal level, maybe we wouldn't have to work so hard. But right now, this is where we are. And I just want to lift those folks up and let people know that, you know, these organizations are with you. There should be resources to check out as well on lots of our websites to help support you in the continuation of education and schooling for your babies. So thank you. This has been a great webcast.
And Zakiya, what you just said is an example of us returning to our cultures. That is the way that we have engaged as peoples with one another. You know, this idea of separation in our neighborhoods, that's not who we are. That's not how we have ever lived. We have always relied on one another. And I think it is a lesson that we as people actually bring to this United States. You know, if we operated in more communal ways, imagine what we would be able to achieve for our families and for our children.
Yes, yeah.
Rhonda, may I just share too, because I think Zakiya touched me in a major way. Rhonda knows my daughter, my youngest daughter, Robin, who just she's a foster mother now for about a month. Two little ones, 1, 2, 1, 3, and she's learning and she's experiencing the power and importance of the village because she has to work. You know, she's working virtually, but she's also working for Youth Build USA. And so, you know, the people who have come and say, I'll take them, or I'll do this. I mean, that's what we've been doing. That's what we had to return to that as well. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you guys so much. Like, this has been more than amazing. And I hate that we have like literally 65 seconds left. So just really want to, again, thank you guys for being here. Really, you know, a call to action for the audience, right? Learn more about the frameworks that you've learned and heard here, but some things for you to ponder, which came from these last final remarks that really just hit me. Like, do you want change? Like, do you really want things to change? Do you want to change, right? Before we start asking about commitment to disrupting dehumanization, do you want to disrupt dehumanization, right? Are you willing to run the marathon, right? Are you gonna post about it or are you gonna run it, right? And this idea of like, how do we negotiate our personal healing and liberation versus the community liberation, right? An intersection of the two. But as you know, Zakiya said so eloquently, in the ways that our people, Black and brown people, have come together and done and taken care of ourselves and our villages have grown. In the words of my good brother Will, liberation is certain, and I'm certain of that, and I believe that that liberation is certain. And so, thank you guys so much for coming and talking with us. There will be a post-event reflection survey for all of the audience members to answer, and we'll be back here on September 22nd on our next episode, The Land Isn't Barren, Disrupting the Dehumanization of Our Communities, right? And as Rhonda said, we'll really be focused on policy. And so we really, really hope you guys can come back and join us in 2 weeks for that webcast. And, you know, I don't know if we have any more time, facilitators, but like literally if the panelists can go around and say like a 10-second thing about your organization, where people can find you, that would be great for our listeners and our viewers.
I'll hop in really quickly because I have to hop to another call, but you can find us at brightbeamnetwork.org. Also for Racial Justice Now, you can find us at rjndmv.org. Thank you. This has been great, everybody.
Thank you. You can find us at coseboc.org. That's COSEBOC, COSEBOC, Coalition of Schools Educating Boys of Color.
You can find Amistades at amistadesinc.org. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter and Instagram. Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks everybody. You can find us at NACAschool.org as the charter school in Albuquerque, or the network is NACA-inspired-schools-network.org. Thank you.
Will.
Oh, sorry. You can find us at villageofwisdom.org or blackgenius.com. All our social media handles are Village of Wisdom, so just at Village of Wisdom. And if you want to hear my meanderings on Twitter, it's at P period.
Rhonda, Howard, Forward Promise, Robert Wood Johnson.
Yes, so you can find us at forwardpromise.org. And there's tons of information there about our dehumanization framework, as well as about many of the organizations that were on the webcast today.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. It's so amazing. I wish we could talk for another 2 hours. But thank you for your work and your commitment to your communities and our overall community and the genius of our Black and brown babies. So yeah, that's it for me. Blessings.